Deep in the Mississippi swamp, the night doesn't just fall, it hunts. When a seasoned trapper finds a footprint too large to be human and hears a howl that silences the entire forest, he realizes the legends are real. And a week later, three friends follow his map straight into a buried secret that was never meant to be uncovered. Because something out there doesn't just kill, it watches. The stories were for children and drunkards. Harlan Tucker had heard them all his life, muttered over bait shop counters and around dying campfires. Tales of the piney woods wolf, a shadow with teeth that walked like a man. At 62, with a trap line that stretched 10 miles through the Atchafalaya Basin, Harlan dealt intangible things: the weight of a pelt, the chill of a rifle barrel, the precise snap of a well-set trap. Superstition was a luxury for those who didn't understand the swamp's simpler, hungrier truths. Which was why the track stopped him cold. Dusk was a slow bleed of orange through the cypress knees, the air thick enough to drink, tasting of peat and decay. He was on the return leg, his game bag light, the familiar symphony of frogs and insects already tuning up. Then his boot sank, not into mud, but into an impression pressed deep into a rare patch of soft earth beside the game trail. He knelt, brushing away a veil of mosquitoes. It was a print, but like none he'd ever seen. Larger than a bear's pad, with 5 long, splayed toes ending in gouges that spoke of claws, not nails. The arch was all wrong, too high, almost human in its structure. Yet the sheer size defied logic. No gator, no panther, no stray dog from the backwoods settlements made this. He placed his own hand beside it. The print dwarfed his spread fingers. A cold trickle, unrelated to the sweat soaking his shirt, traced his spine. He told himself it was a distortion, a trick of the sinking light on overlapping deer tracks. He rose quickly, shouldering his .30-06 and moved on, his pace unconsciously quicker. Not as a descent, but as a rising tide of black, swallowing the murky green of the day. It was then the silence came. Not the gentle lull between night sounds, but an absolute void. The frogs ceased their chorus mid-croak. The insects' whine cut out as if severed. Even the water seemed to stop its sluggish flow. The only sound was the frantic thump of his own heart and the squelch of his boots in the muck. He flicked on his flashlight, its beam a frail, trembling column in the immense dark, catching only the gnarled trunks of tupelo trees and curtains of Spanish moss that swayed without wind. The howl tore the silence apart. It was low at first, a guttural rumble that vibrated in his chest, rising into a ragged, ululating shriek that seemed to claw at the sky. It held a terrible, almost musical note of rage and hunger. Coyotes, he thought desperately, a big pack, their voices overlapping. But coyotes yipped and chattered. This was a single monstrous voice, and it was moving. It echoed from the west, then impossibly fast, seemed to answer itself from the north, closer. The beam of his light jerked across the undergrowth. Something shifted in the periphery, a coalescence of shadows just beyond the light's reach, a bulk that slipped between 2 pines with a fluid, predatory grace. Too tall for a deer, too silent for a bear. Primal fear, older than reason, flooded his veins. His finger found the rifle's trigger guard, the metal slick with humidity. He tried to recall the sound of a bull gator's bellow, a bobcat's scream, anything to cage this thing in a known taxonomy. But his mind, trained for a lifetime in this swamp, supplied no match. The stories whispered in his memory, not as fiction, but as dreadful, forgotten warnings. He froze, breath held. The oppressive heat felt suddenly icy. The howl came again, this time from due east, so close he could hear the intake of breath before the cry. And then a second voice answered from the south, deeper, more resonant. They were not echoes. They were two distinct points, two separate hunters, and they were closing in, methodically, driving him toward the center of a tightening circle. The beam of his flashlight shook, illuminating the frantic dance of gnats in the air before him and the profound, waiting darkness beyond. A week later, the swamp had digested Harlan Tucker's fear, leaving only the usual simmering humidity and the drone of a billion insects. 3 figures picked their way along a less traveled creek bank, their laughter a foreign sound in the ancient stillness. Leo led, his eyes scanning the ground with a historian's curiosity rather than a hiker's caution. Maya followed, her senses pricked by every rustle in the palmetto thickets. Ben brought up the rear, his broad shoulders and easy smirk broadcasting a jock's disdain for the subtle unease that clung to the air like the moss overhead. It was Maya who saw it first, a flash of unnatural color in the brown and green monotony. Nestled in the crook of a cypress root, half submerged in the tea-colored water of the creek, was a backpack. It was a durable, camouflage-patterned model, but its condition halted their casual chatter. Long, parallel gashes had torn through the fabric, as if slashed by monstrous claws. One strap was severed completely, and dark, muddy stains blotched the material. The swamp was in the process of claiming it, with tendrils of algae already knitting across its surface. Leo waded into the warm water, his academic intrigue overriding any sanitary concern. He hauled the sodden pack onto the bank with a wet thud. The zippers were rusted shut, but the main compartment had been ripped open. Inside, waterlogged and mildewed, were the artifacts of a practical life: a rusting multi-tool, a box of waterlogged matches, a tin of dried-up sardines. And beneath it all, wrapped in a surprisingly intact plastic bag, was a leather-bound journal and a folded square of topographic map. The journal's pages were warped, the ink blurred in places, but the handwriting was frantic, jagged, a script of mounting terror. Leo read aloud, his voice dropping to a murmur that fought against the buzz of flies. Entries detailed trap lines and weather, then shifted. Found a track today. No goddamn animal makes that. 5 toes. Like a man, but huge. The next page, dated just over a week prior, was worse. The silence is wrong. It's listening. Heard the howl. Not coyote. Not anything. It's hurting me. The final entry was a chaotic scrawl, barely legible. They're working together. Lights no good. Making for the high ground. If found, tell someone. The old cemetery. Map marks it. It knows. It knows the dead places. A profound quiet settled over the trio, broken only by the creek's gurgle. Leo unfolded the map. It was a standard geological survey, but overlaid with precise hand-drawn lines in red ink. One path, marked with a trembling X, showed Harlan's trap line. Another, boulder route arrowed deep into a section marked as impassable wetland, ending at a small, star-shaped symbol with the word Cypress Hollow beside it. In the margin, in the same frantic hand, was written, "Where it sleeps, where it buries." Maya hugged herself, feeling the oppressive air grow heavier. "We need to take this to the rangers, now." Ben snorted, kicking at a rotten log. "Come on, some old coot's hunting diary and a bad art project? He probably got drunk, ripped his own bag on a branch, and wandered off to sleep it off. It knows the dead places. Seriously?" He mimicked a spooky voice, but the gesture fell flat, swallowed by the swamp's watchful presence. Leo traced the red line on the map, his academic intrigue alight with a more immediate kind of discovery. Maya simply stared into the tangled green gloom, where the last echoes of the cry seemed to linger like a poison in the air. Wordlessly, the decision was made. They would not leave tonight. The fading light was now an enemy. They would return to their campsite, build a fire too big, and wait for dawn. And with the first gray light, against every screaming instinct, they would follow the dead man's map into the heart of the silence. The creature's promise, or warning, hung among them, a third presence in the clearing as they gathered the damning evidence and hurried back toward their tent, the shredded backpack left behind, like a gutted warning they could no longer ignore. Dawn was a gray, reluctant seep through the canopy, offering light but no warmth. The swamp exhaled a thick, pearlescent mist that coiled around their knees and obscured the ground, making every step a potential plunge into hidden water or a tangle of roots. They moved in a tense single file, Leo navigating with Harlan's map clutched in a white-knuckled hand, Maya in the middle, and Ben, uncharacteristically quiet, taking the rear guard. The monstrous howl of the previous evening had shattered his skepticism, leaving a brittle, watchful anxiety in its place. Their progress was agonizingly slow, a symphony of sucked-in breaths and the wet sounds of mud releasing their boots. The map led them through a landscape that felt increasingly primordial. They waded through stagnant channels where the water was black and oily, skirting colossal cypress trunks bearded with moss that stirred in the still air as if breathing. The usual cacophony of life was subdued here, replaced by an intermittent, dripping silence. The red X on the map seemed to pulse in Leo's mind. Where it buries. The words from the journal were a cold stone in his gut. After 2 hours of silent struggle, the ground began a subtle, firming rise. The standing water receded, replaced by a thick carpet of damp leaf litter and a congregation of ancient, gnarled live oaks instead of cypress. The mist thinned, and then they saw the stones. They were not upright markers, but slabs of dark, water-smoothed rock, sunken and canted at odd angles like rotten teeth pushing through the gum of the earth. There were perhaps a dozen, arranged in no discernible pattern. Leo approached the nearest, brushing away a crust of lichen and moss. The symbol carved into its surface was no cross, no angel, no familiar epitaph. It was a series of concentric circles intersected by a jagged lightning bolt line. Another stone bore a spiral that ended in a cluster of sharp, radiating strokes. Another showed a stylized beast, elongated and many-limbed, more suggestion than representation. "These aren't Christian," Leo whispered, his voice hushed with awe and dread. He ran his fingers over the grooves, worn shallow by centuries of rain. The style, it's reminiscent of mound builder iconography, or maybe very early indigenous trade goods. Pre-colonial for sure. This place is old, older than any recorded settlement in this parish. Maya stared at the spiraling symbol, feeling a vertigo that had nothing to do with the landscape. They buried their dead out here? Why so far, so deep? Isolation, protection, Leo's eyes were wide, or containment. Some cultures believed certain spirits or certain people needed to be interred in places of power or places far from the living. The implication hung in the moist air. This was not a resting place for peaceful ancestors. It was Ben who found the anomaly. "Over here," he called, his voice tight. On the edge of the sunken stone circle, the earth was disturbed. It was a low, oblong mound, roughly 7 feet long, constructed not of stone slabs, but gathered field stones and packed clay-heavy mud. The moss on the stones was fresh, the mud still dark and damp compared to the surrounding leaf litter. This mound was weeks old, not centuries. A profound, instinctual horror kept them still for a long moment. This was the recent work mentioned in the journal. This was what the map had led them to. The mist curled around the crude grave like a shroud. With a shared, unspoken resolve that felt like madness, they began to dismantle it. The stones were heavy, cold. The mud came away in clumps. The smell that arose was not of deep decay, but something sharper, fainter, a mineral scent of wet bone and something coppery. They uncovered the remains piece by piece. A massive, elongated skull, canine in shape, but grotesquely oversized, the jaw lined with yellowed, dagger-like teeth. A scatter of vertebrae, thick as a man's wrist. Long, brutal leg bones that ended in fearsome, curved claws. It was the skeleton of a wolf of impossible proportions, a creature of nightmare anatomy. And tangled within the ribcage, matted with dark earth and stained beyond recognition, were not more bones, but fabric. Tattered fragments of a red and black flannel shirt, a shred of denim, the molded remnant of a leather work boot. Modern clothing, ensnared within the beast's remains, as if it had been wearing them when it died. The world seemed to tilt. Leo stumbled back, his academic detachment vaporized. Maya brought a hand to her mouth, a stifled sound escaping her throat. Ben just stared, his face ashen. The horrifying implication crashed over them with the force of a physical blow. This was no simple predator. The creature had not just killed Harlan Tucker, it had understood him, taken something from him, and then worn him, or tried to. The burial mound itself was the most terrifying clue of all. An act of ritual, of concealment, or of respect, performed by something that was neither wolf nor man, but a monstrous hybrid of both. It had buried its own dead, or a shed skin of itself, and used stones to hide the evidence. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the clearing, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very trees. It didn't come from the grave at their feet. It came from the dense wall of shadowy cypress and mist at the tree line 20 yards away. They turned as one, their blood freezing. 2 pinpricks of faint amber light reflected in the gloom, eyes holding the height of a tall man. The growl deepened, a promise of rending flesh and shattered bone. They were not alone. They had been led here, allowed to find the grave, to understand. The realization was a cold knife twisting in their chests. The werewolf had not just killed Harlan, it had understood burial, and it had been watching them patiently since the moment they found the shredded backpack by the creek. The thing in the trees took a single, deliberate step forward, the mist swirling around its immense, shadowed form.